They insisted it was for the best. But imagine your mother calmly telling you, "Don't come to your own sister's wedding. You'll embarrass us." I smiled, nodded, and walked away without a word. 2 weeks later, while they were posing for magazines at Chloe's high society ceremony, I walked down an aisle lined with wildflowers holding hands with children who called me their lucky charm. The live stream shattered every expectation. Celebrities reposted it, millions donated, and my phone lit up with the same parents who once told me I didn't belong. I'm Madeline Carter, and this is how losing my family helped me find myself. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The April air outside my parents' house in Greenwood Village still carried a faint chill, the kind that slips through the seams of a perfect evening. Through the tall windows, I could see the dining room glowing. Every plate gleaming, every candle trimmed the kind of immaculate order my mother worshipped. I hesitated on the porch hands, buried in my coat pockets, before pressing the bell. Rebecca Carter opened the door herself. Lips painted, posture flawless. She smiled the way she always did for guests, not for family. "You made it," she said, stepping aside. The smell of white roses filled the hall, overwhelming and cold. Inside, my father, Thomas Carter, sat at the far end of the mahogany table, glasses perched low on his nose as he scrolled through his tablet. He nodded without looking up. "Madeline. Just my name, nothing more." I slipped into my chair. The table looked like a magazine spread. Crystal silverware aligned a centerpiece taller than my arm. My mother adjusted a napkin by my plate, even though it was already perfect. "How's work, dear? Still consulting for those charity groups?" I smiled, unsure if it was a question or a test. "Yes. Things are steady. We just wrapped a clean water project in Arizona. That's nice," she said. Voice flat. "It's good you keep yourself busy." Before I could reply, heels clicked on the staircase. Chloe floated down, wrapped in a pale pink dress that shimmered under the chandelier. My mother's face softened instantly. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." Chloe blushed, setting down her phone. "Thanks, Mom." She glanced at me quickly, then away, so I started forcing a brightness into my tone. "Big day coming soon, huh? How's everything going with the wedding plans?" The pause that followed was long enough for the clock in the hall to tick twice. My mother lifted her head, her expression gentle but rehearsed. "About that," she began. "Your name isn't on the guest list, Maddie." At first, I thought she was joking. I laughed softly. "What do you mean?" She placed her napkin on the table, smoothing it with her fingertips. "It's better if you don't come. You'd ruin the family's image. People still remember what happened with the company." The air in the room thickened. My father's tablet dimmed to black. He didn't look up. Chloe's eyes dropped to her lap. "Ruin the image," I repeated, almost whispering. "That's what this is about." My mother's tone stayed calm, like she was explaining something simple to a child. "It's not personal. You know how these things work. Ryan's family has a certain reputation, and after everything, well, it's best if you sit this one out." I looked at my sister, Chloe. She flinched. "It's Mom's decision. You know how she gets when she's stressed." My mother's voice sharpened. "This isn't stress. It's prudence." Silence spread between us. The clink of the chandelier crystal was the only sound. I took a breath, the kind you take before diving underwater. "Sure," I said, smiling faintly. "I know my place." My father finally spoke, barely above a murmur. "Let's not turn this into a scene." I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped the marble, an ugly sound in such a perfect room. "Don't worry, Dad. I wouldn't dream of it." I walked toward the hallway. On the wall above the piano hung our last family portrait. Thomas, Rebecca, and Chloe all glowing under studio lights. I stepped closer and saw the faint outline where my image had been cropped out for the reprint. My mother called after me, "Maddie, don't take this the wrong way." I stopped at the door, my hand on the frame. "Is there a right way to take it?" She said nothing. The silence felt colder than the air outside. Voiceover. That was the night the house stopped being home. Every polite word, every glimmering surface, every photograph on the wall, all of it turned to glass, reflecting me as the piece that didn't fit. I stepped out into the driveway. The roses along the path swayed under the porch light, beautiful and suffocating. When I looked back through the window, I saw them still sitting at the table, frozen in their perfect picture. The door closed behind me with a quiet click. It sounded like the end of something I'd been pretending wasn't broken. The hum of the city below always sounded different from the 20th floor of Carter Developments. Back in 2017, that view made me feel like I belonged to something powerful, something permanent. The glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting Denver's skyline like a promise. I was 27, the youngest strategist the company had ever promoted. My father used to brag about that at dinners. My daughter, he'd say, built our brand campaigns before she could drive, but by then he'd stopped saying it. That morning, the conference room smelled of burnt coffee and tension. Charts and maps of a new development project spread across the table, plots of land just outside Aurora marked in bold red lines. I had spent the weekend reviewing the permit files and knew something was off. The zoning numbers didn't match, and some signatures looked copied. I waited until everyone had finished presenting before speaking, and "These documents were altered," I said, flipping through the binder. "The acreage listed doesn't match the approved limits. If we move forward with this, it's fraud." The room went still. My father's jaw tightened. "We've already signed the partnership contract," he said. "The papers are being finalized. You must have misread something." I didn't misread anything, I said quietly. "Dad, this isn't about profit margins. It's about legality. We could lose the license." He leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "You're not here to police me. You're here to make this company look good. I'm here to make it honest," I replied. "If we don't fix this, I'll have to withdraw my name from the project." He slammed his palm on the table. "Don't you dare lecture me about ethics. Everything we have, this office, this family's reputation, exists because I know how to handle things." I felt every eye on me, the quiet rustle of papers replaced by silence heavy enough to crush. I gathered my notes, heart hammering, then handle it without me. As I walked out, I saw my mother standing by the hallway window, holding her phone but not pretending to use it. She must have heard everything. Her eyes met mine for a moment, soft but unreadable. She didn't speak. I kept walking. That night I worked late in my cubicle drafting an internal memo to the compliance board. Around 10, my access to the shared drive vanished. Then my email stopped syncing. I refreshed twice, then saw the message flash across the screen. Access denied. My father had moved faster than I expected. By morning, the company issued a statement to investors, assuring them that minor clerical inconsistencies were resolved. My phone buzzed non-stop with calls from colleagues, some pretending to check in, others fishing for gossip. I ignored them all. I drove to my parents' house that evening. The house lights were dim except for the kitchen where my mother sat at the counter scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. I told the truth. "Sometimes the truth costs too much," she answered. "Your father is furious. He's furious because he got caught." Her head lifted, then eyes sharp. "Because you embarrassed him. And us. I was trying to protect the family's name." She exhaled, setting her phone down. "Families don't need martyrs, Maddie. They need loyalty. Loyalty." The word tasted bitter in my mouth. "So that's what this is now. Blind loyalty. This family doesn't need someone who always needs to be right," she said, turning away. "It needs someone who knows when to be quiet." The next morning, the news broke. Carter Developments under investigation for zoning violations. My father's photo filled the screen, smiling confidently beside a headline that burned. The anchors speculated, analysts weighed in, and for 3 days Denver talked about nothing else. Then, as quickly as it started, it disappeared. Settled quietly, no charges filed. My father's lawyers and his friends in City Hall made sure of it. But the whispers stayed. At the office, people stopped talking when I walked by. One colleague muttered snitch under his breath. Another asked, "Was it worth it?" I didn't answer. My father refused to see me. My mother sent one message. "Give it time. Don't say anything to the press." I didn't, but silence didn't save me. When I came home that weekend, my mother met me at the door with a glass of wine and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've caused enough chaos," she said. "Let's not make it worse." I asked, "Are you even angry at him, or just at me for not pretending everything's fine?" She stared out the window. "You don't understand what it takes to hold a family together. Maybe I don't," I said. "Because this doesn't feel like together." She turned the light, catching the diamond at her wrist. "Madeline, this family doesn't need someone who's right. It needs someone who knows how to stay silent." The words landed harder than any argument could. I remember standing there, hearing the clock tick in the foyer, feeling something inside me shift, like a thread snapping. I nodded once, left my keys on the table, and walked out. The rearview mirror caught the image of our house shrinking behind me, golden under the porch lights. I saw my mother's reflection in the upstairs window, small and still. The farther I drove, the more the lights blurred into streaks. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. That was the night I stopped belonging to the Carters and started belonging to myself. Morning sunlight leaked through the thin curtains of my apartment, slicing across the hardwood floor and spilling onto my laptop. The city outside was already alive. Honking cars, the smell of roasted coffee from the cafe below, the sound of someone walking their dog on the sidewalk. I sat at the small kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, scrolling through the local news without really reading it. Then I saw the headline. Denver's most anticipated wedding. Chloe Carter and Ryan Ellis. Tie the knot. My stomach tightened before I even clicked. The photos loaded slowly, one after another. My sister in a designer gown, the son of the mayor smiling beside her. Their ceremony took place at the Brown Palace chandeliers, glittering above hundreds of guests. I scrolled past photo after photo until one stopped me. The official family portrait. Rebecca and Thomas Carter stood behind the couple, proud and polished. The lighting was perfect, the smiles effortless, and the space where I used to stand, the far left corner, was filled with an arrangement of lilies. I closed the laptop. I didn't realize how quiet the apartment had become until I heard the hum of the refrigerator. I leaned back in the chair, eyes tracing the ceiling. It wasn't the picture that hurt. It was how complete it looked without me. I thought I'd feel anger. Instead, there was only that familiar emptiness, the kind that made sound echo differently inside your chest. Not rage, not grief, just absence. Not long after my phone buzzed, a text from an old colleague I hadn't spoken to in years. You were the only one back then who told the truth. I never forgot. I stared at the screen for a long moment, thumb hovering over the keyboard. But I didn't reply. What was there to say? That telling the truth cost me a family. That silence, in the end, became easier than trying to explain. I set the phone face down. The view from my window looked out onto a small park. It was spring, and the trees were finally green again after months of gray. A group of kids were kicking a soccer ball near the benches. Their laughter rose faintly, the sound light and untangled. I envied them for a second, the way belonging came naturally to them. No performance, no approval to earn, just noise and sunlight and freedom. I opened my email more out of habit than intention. The inbox was full newsletters, sponsorship updates, a few old clients checking in. Buried between them was an invitation to a CSR summit in Chicago, a conference for corporate social responsibility and sustainable marketing. My world, the one I'd built from scratch after walking away from Carter Developments. I hovered over the RSVP link. The old version of me would have gone smiled networked, pretended nothing hurt. But now the thought of standing in a ballroom full of people chasing image and influence made my stomach turn. I closed the email. For a while I just sat there listening to the city move around me. A siren in the distance. A train horn. The kettle starting to hiss again on the stove. Somewhere beneath all of it, a small voice whispered that maybe I didn't need to run back to the same circles to find meaning. Maybe meaning could be smaller, quieter. I pulled my notebook closer. The one I kept for ideas, thoughts, pieces of plans that never quite became real. The last page had a list of rejected brand campaigns, and notes for a client who'd backed out when they realized philanthropy doesn't pay. I turned to a fresh page, uncapped a pen, and just sat there until the words found me. A wedding doesn't have to be grand to matter. The sentence came easily, as if it had been waiting all along. It wasn't about marriage or family. It was about creating something honest in a world obsessed with appearances. I wrote another line beneath it. Maybe it wasn't the kind of message that wins awards, but it was mine. The park outside was empty now, except for one little girl spinning under a tree trying to catch the sunlight with her hands. I smiled without meaning to. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, watching her twirl in the light, was the first time I imagined what peace could look like. And maybe, just maybe, what my own kind of celebration might someday become. The cafe in lower downtown Denver was one of those places that smelled permanently of roasted beans and rain. Ethan and I sat by the window, our coffee cooling between us as he spread a set of sketches across the small round table. Lines and measurements stretched over the paper. Arched hallways, open courtyards, a garden carved into the side of a hill. "This is St. Helena," he said, tapping the top of the page. "It used to be a monastery, then a shelter for children. The nuns still run it. It's about 2 hours from here up past Glenwood Springs. They could use the help, and honestly, it's beautiful. I studied the drawings, the way sunlight filtered through the windows of his sketches. You think it could work for a wedding? Not just a wedding, he said. Something that means something. You've spent years building campaigns for causes. Why not make this one yours? We could turn it into a benefit event. Donations instead of gifts. A live stream for charity. I smiled at the way he said we like it was already ours. You make it sound simple. It doesn't have to be complicated, he said. We can start small. The right people will find us. His faith in me was something I hadn't grown used to yet. Everyone else wanted proof results credentials. Ethan just believed. I folded the sketches carefully. It's going to take money, I said. And sponsors. And, God, logistics. Do you know how many people we'd have to convince? He reached for my hand. You've convinced tougher crowds than this. You got a clean energy startup off the ground when no one thought it would work. Remember that? Yeah, I said, laughing under my breath. But that didn't have flowers and catering. Flowers and catering are easy, he said. Purpose is harder. You already have that part figured out. That night, back in my apartment, I made a list of organizations to call: environmental groups, child welfare foundations, old clients who owed me favors. I started the next morning with coffee and determination, dialing one after another. Most responses were polite refusals. It sounds lovely, but our focus this quarter is elsewhere. Without major press coverage, it might be difficult to justify sponsorship. It's a sweet idea, but not scalable. By noon, I'd been turned down 7 times. By Friday, 15. It wasn't rejection that hurt. It was how they didn't even listen long enough to imagine it. They were chasing visibility, not meaning. Over the next week, I sent email after email, tailoring every message to sound less idealistic, more strategic. I met former colleagues in coffee shops, people who used to shake my hand at industry events, but now spoke in cautious tones, afraid my last name might still be bad luck. Most smiled and said, "Let me think about it," then disappeared. Still, I kept writing, calling, knocking on digital doors. Ethan checked in every evening, usually with takeout and a grin. Any luck? Depends on your definition, I'd answer. If luck means polite rejection, then yes. He laughed, kissed my temple, and told me to keep going. It was Daniel Hayes who finally said yes. Daniel was a venture capitalist who once ran a mentorship program I helped rescue from bankruptcy years ago. He'd been through his own PR disaster once, something about a failed investment that nearly ruined him. I called him, expecting another no. When I finished explaining the concept, an intimate wedding at a mountain orphanage live-streamed to raise money for children's education, he didn't hesitate. "I'm in," he said. "Send me the details. And Maddie, don't make it about the size. Make it about the story." His words lit something in me I didn't realize I'd lost. The following week, a few more names trickled in. A designer from Chicago offered to donate her time. A former client pledged to help with video production. Mia, my best friend, volunteered to handle the press once it was ready. Slowly, pieces began falling into place like a puzzle that had been waiting for the right hands. One evening, I sat alone at my desk, the city outside glowing in streaks of orange and blue. My computer screen displayed a draft invitation, minimal white background, black serif text. At the bottom, a single line read, "A celebration of truth, love, and the belief that kindness can change the world." I hesitated before typing the list of recipients. Daniel, Mia, the designer, a handful of contacts who had once believed in me. I added a few new names, people I admired but never had the courage to reach out to. Then I read the subject line again. A different kind of wedding. Ethan called from the other room. "Dinner's ready." 1 second, I yelled back. My cursor hovered over the button. My chest felt tight, but not from fear. It was something quieter, relief maybe. The feeling of moving towards something instead of running from it. I clicked send. The screen blinked once, then returned to my inbox. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair, exhaling. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt aligned, like all the noise around me had finally settled into a single, clear note. Somewhere between faith and foolishness, a plan had taken shape, and whether the world noticed or not, I knew this time it would be mine. The Carter house always looked like a showroom. No fingerprints, no clutter, not even a misplaced pillow. That week it buzzed with the precision of a corporate event. Florists moved through the hallways carrying crates of white roses flown in from Italy. Rebecca Carter stood in the center of the living room, clipboard in hand, directing everyone like a general before battle. "Those arrangements belong by the piano, not the window," she said, waving one hand without looking up. "And make sure the photographer gets a shot of the imported crystal. It's a gift from the mayor's wife." Thomas's voice echoed from his office loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell them we'll double the sponsorship if we can get a feature in the Post-Nome." The Chronicle. Bigger audience. Chloe, dressed in silk and makeup, was sitting in front of a ring light upstairs, posing for behind-the-scenes content for her brand. Her assistant adjusted the camera angle while a stylist sprayed her hair. "Turn your head a little more, Chloe," the photographer said. "Perfect. Hold that smile." The flash went off again and again until Chloe's cheeks ached. She took a break, pulling her phone to scroll through the flood of comments under her latest post. Most were compliments, some fake enthusiasm from people she barely knew. She locked the screen. Downstairs, her mother's voice carried through the stairwell. "We have to make sure the guest list doesn't leak. The press will eat it up if they find out we have a senator attending." Chloe sighed and leaned against the vanity. She could hear the staff moving furniture, the sound of delivery trucks outside. For years, she had admired her mother's ability to make perfection look effortless. But now, watching it from the inside, she could see the cracks. The panic behind Rebecca's voice, the way Thomas's eyes darted when money was mentioned, the exhaustion hidden under expensive clothes. I used to envy them, I thought. Now, all I saw was how hollow it had become. When the photo shoot wrapped, Chloe slipped out of the room, barefoot, carrying a glass of champagne. She wandered into the attic, a place untouched by decorators. The air smelled of dust and cedar. Boxes stacked neatly along the walls, labeled in her mother's handwriting. She opened one at random. Old family photos, drawings, Christmas cards. Inside a small frame lay a faded picture of two girls, maybe 6 and 10, sitting on the edge of a muddy construction lot. Their dresses were splattered with dirt, their smiles wide and unposed. The older one, Madeline, had her arm around her little sister, shielding her from the sun. Chloe sat on the floor and stared at it. For a long time, she forgot to breathe. That day was the summer her sister built a cardboard office in the backyard, making fake blueprints, and telling her they would build houses for everyone who needed one. It was the first time Chloe ever believed in something bigger than herself. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. Rebecca's voice. Chloe hid the photo behind her leg as her mother appeared in the doorway, still holding the clipboard. "What are you doing up here? Guests will arrive for the rehearsal dinner soon." Chloe hesitated. "I was just looking for something." Rebecca stepped closer, the smell of her perfume filling the space. Her eyes landed on the box. "Don't get nostalgic, darling. Those old things are sentimental clutter." "It's just a photo," Chloe said quietly. Rebecca straightened her blazer. "This week isn't about the past. It's about image, about the future of this family. Everything has to look perfect." Chloe looked at the picture again, thumb brushing the edge of the frame. "Mom, what if the image isn't real anymore?" Rebecca froze. "Excuse me. What if people can see it's fake?" Her mother's face hardened. "Perception is reality. Don't forget that." Chloe met her eyes. Maddie never cared about perception. Rebecca's tone sharpened. Maddie didn't know when to stay quiet. Look where that got her. The silence after that was heavy, filled only by the hum of the attic lights. Chloe swallowed, her voice barely audible. Maybe she was the only one who ever told the truth. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but her grip on the clipboard tightened. Without another word, she turned and walked out, heels clicking down the stairs. Chloe stayed where she was, alone in the attic, surrounded by boxes of memories her mother wanted erased. She pulled the photo into her lap and studied her sister's face again. Bright eyes, that fearless grin. She whispered to the empty room. "You should have been here, Maddie." Downstairs, laughter and music floated up from the rehearsal dinner. Chloe stayed seated in the dust and fading light until the noise dimmed. The photo trembled slightly in her hands as she realized how far the family had drifted from the girls in that picture. She slid the frame into her bag before standing. For the first time, the thought of tomorrow's wedding filled her with something she didn't recognize: doubt. The newsroom at the Denver Journal always smelled faintly of ink and burnt coffee. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, a woman named Julia Stein sat at her desk scrolling through an inbox full of pitches and press releases. She stopped when she saw one subject line that didn't sound like the others. Hope in the mountains. A charity wedding. She clicked it. The email was short, formal. No attachments, no corporate signature, just a description of a private event in Aspen, organized to raise money for an orphanage and a children's education fund. The donor's name wasn't mentioned. Julia frowned. A charity wedding, she muttered to herself. It was the kind of headline that usually meant influencers seeking attention. But this one felt different. There was no hashtag, no sponsors, no photo links, just a date, a location, and a request for discretion. She leaned over to her colleague across the aisle. "Have you heard of this Hope in the Mountains thing?" He shook his head without looking up. If it's in Aspen, probably another billionaire vanity project. Julia didn't think so. The phrasing in the email, a celebration of truth and love, sounded sincere. Maybe naive, but not performative. She replied to the message listed for contact, a woman named Mia Thompson. Media consultant. Hi. Mia. Julia Stein from the Denver Journal. I'd love to learn more about Hope in the Mountains. Who's behind it? The response came within an hour. Thank you for your interest, Julia. The donor wishes to remain anonymous. The event focuses on the children, not the people funding it. I'll send you a release after the ceremony, if you'd like coverage of the charity results. Julia tapped her pen against the desk. People who wanted to stay anonymous didn't usually email journalists at all. Something about it tugged at her curiosity. By Friday morning, she was in her car heading west toward Aspen. Meanwhile, back in Denver, Ethan and I were eating dinner at home. Take-out Ty on the couch the way we always did when the week got long. He was reading on his phone, but I could feel him studying me. You've been quiet all day, he said finally. I'm just thinking about the wedding, about everything. I pushed a noodle around my plate, smiling faintly. The more we prepare, the more it feels surreal, like I'm walking into someone else's story. He set his phone down. You're nervous, people will find out, I looked up. No, I'm afraid they'll misunderstand. How? That this isn't revenge. I don't want it to look like a statement against my family. It's supposed to be for the kids, for the people who actually need something good in their lives. He reached over, brushed a strand of hair from my face. Madeline, you can't control how the world interprets kindness. Just do the work. Let the rest follow. Later that night, while he slept, I sat by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. I could still hear my mother's voice in my head from that dinner months ago. You'd ruin our family's image. Maybe she was right in her way, but maybe the image needed to be ruined. I whispered to the dark, not expecting an answer. I'm not trying to prove anything. I just want peace. Some truths don't need defending. The world eventually finds them on its own. In Aspen, Julia drove up the narrow road towards St. Helena Monastery. The fog was thick, clinging to the pine trees like smoke. When she arrived, she found the gates open, and the sound of children laughing echoing across the courtyard. A group of little ones chased a soccer ball near the steps, watched by a few women in gray habits. Julia parked and stepped out, introducing herself politely. The head nun, Sister Agnes, greeted her with a kind smile. We don't usually have reporters up here, she said. I'm not here to intrude. I just want to understand who's behind all this. Sister Agnes only smiled again. A woman who believes in quiet miracles. Julia spent the afternoon talking to the staff filming B-roll of the orphanage and the gardens where the ceremony would take place. Every time she asked for a name, the answer was the same. She doesn't want recognition. At sunset, she stood outside the chapel, camera in hand, watching volunteers hang white lanterns along the archway. One of the children ran up to her and pointed to a drawing tacked on the wall. A woman in a wedding dress holding hands with a group of kids. That's her, the little girl said proudly. The lady who smiles a lot. Julia smiled back, a thought forming in her mind. Whoever this woman was, her anonymity wasn't about hiding. It was about sincerity. The next morning she returned to Denver and wrote the story anyway, framing it as a mystery. The Mysterious Bride of Aspen. The headline read. Within hours of publication, the article spread across social media. People speculated wildly, an actress, a philanthropist, A political daughter trying to rebrand her family. Hashtag the mysterious bride trended before noon. I didn't see it right away. I was busy finalizing logistics, reviewing the donation platform, confirming travel for the guests. But when Mia called that evening, her voice carried that mix of panic and excitement I knew too well. "Don't freak out," she said. "But the press might have picked up the story early." "How early?" I asked. "Denver Journal. They didn't name you, but they will soon. It's already viral." I closed my eyes, leaning back against the chair. I should have known this couldn't stay quiet. Ethan looked at me from across the room. "What happened?" "Someone found out," I said. He came closer, resting his hands on my shoulders. "Then let them. You weren't hiding because you were ashamed." I nodded, though my stomach still twisted. Silence had always been my shield. But maybe it was time to let the noise in. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains, low and distant. Something was beginning, and for once I didn't need to stop it. Morning fog hugged the peaks around St. Helena, like a veil, the kind that softened everything it touched. The air smelled of pine and wet earth when I woke. The room was small, bare wood floors, white curtains fluttering in the open window. But it felt like peace. From outside came the sound of laughter, high and bright. I pushed the curtain aside and saw the children running in the courtyard, chasing each other through beams of early sunlight. Ethan stood behind me, half-dressed, tie draped around his neck. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "Too quiet," I said. He smiled, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Today's the day, Maddie. Ours." For a moment, I just nodded, unable to trust my voice. I'd spent months preparing for this, but the calm that morning was new, steady, weightless. Downstairs, the courtyard was alive. The nuns moved between tables, setting out flowers picked from the surrounding hillsides. Sister Agnes supervised gently, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes full of quiet pride. "Wildflowers last longer than roses," she told me, adjusting a strand of ivy that hung from the archway. "They're not as fragile." Inside the chapel, the old wooden pews were polished candles flickering under the painted ceiling. A group of local musicians tuned their violins near the altar. The scent of lavender hung in the air. As I walked through, the children ran past me, arms full of petals. "Miss Maddie, we get to throw these, right?" one asked. "You do," I said, smiling. "But not until after the music starts." They squealed and disappeared again. Guests began arriving by noon. I watched from the window of the chapel office as the courtyard filled. The faces I saw were ones I hadn't expected to ever see together. Daniel Hayes' sharp suit and calm smile, shaking hands with a UN delegate I'd once worked with, a well-known actress whose charity I'd helped promote, 2 journalists from overseas who'd covered humanitarian stories. None of them came for glamour. They came because they believed. Ethan joined me by the door, straightening his tie. "You ready?" "Not even a little," I said. He laughed softly. "Good, that's how you know it's real." Sister Agnes entered with the veil draped over her arm. "It's time," she said. Her voice carried warmth, not ceremony. She placed the veil carefully on my hair, her hands steady despite her age. "Grace sewed the edges herself," she whispered. I turned to look in the mirror. The fabric shimmered faintly in the golden light. "It's beautiful." "She said she wanted you to feel like one of them," Agnes said. "A little wild, a little brave." When the first notes of the violin drifted through the air, the children lined up at the entrance holding small baskets of petals. I took Ethan's arm. The chapel doors opened, flooding the space with sunlight. The crowd rose as we stepped outside. Beyond the archway, the mountains stood endless and steady, a reminder that some things endure, no matter who tries to erase them. I caught sight of Mia, near the front camera in hand, smiling through tears. The aisle was a path of white and yellow petals, wildflowers mixed in like confetti from nature itself. As we walked, the children tossed handfuls into the air. Their laughter echoed through the valley, and, for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own story. I once thought kindness made me small, but I was wrong. Kindness makes people listen. It brings the right ones close. When we reached the altar, Ethan squeezed my hand. The officiant spoke briefly, about unity, compassion, second chances. His words faded into the hum of wind through the trees. Ethan looked at me, eyes steady. "I promise to build with you, not for you," he said. "To make the world softer, even when it isn't kind." My throat tightened. "And I promise to believe in us even when others don't." As we said our vows, the cameras from Charity Stream Global captured every detail. The children's faces, the mountain light, the quiet dignity of it all. Across the world, the live stream began. Then, as the ceremony ended, a tiny figure darted out from the front row. Grace, the smallest of the children. She carried a bunch of wildflowers wrapped in twine. Everyone turned as she ran straight up to me, grinning wide. "For you," she said breathlessly. The audience fell silent. She reached up her little hands, brushing against my dress. I knelt, taking the flowers. "Thank you, sweetheart." She hugged me so tightly that my veil slipped from my shoulder. The room exhaled. Cameras clicked. Someone in the crowd wiped away tears. When I stood, I saw Daniel Hayes lift his phone, capturing the moment. A second later, he whispered to Mia, who nodded, uploading the image to her feed. By the time we walked back down the aisle, the photo had already started to spread online. A bride in white holding a child covered in sunlight surrounded by mountains. Someone captioned it, "The wedding that touched the world." And even as the music swelled, I felt something shift in the air. The silence I'd carried for years was no longer mine alone. In the control room of Charity Stream Global, rows of monitors glowed like a constellation of blue light. Technicians leaned forward in their chairs, eyes fixed on the analytics dashboard. The numbers were climbing fast. First 100,000 viewers, then 500,000. Within an hour, the counter flashed past 1 million. Someone whistled low. "Whoever this bride is, she just broke our morning record," he said. The feed displayed a still frame of me and Ethan at the altar, surrounded by the children of St. Helena. The comments section rolled endlessly, hearts, prayers, people asking who we were. By midday, the number passed 5 million. Screens filled with notifications from international charities reposting the stream. A caption appeared again and again, #KindnessViral, in downtown Denver. Julia Stein sat at her desk staring at the headline she'd written a week earlier. "The Mysterious Bride of Aspen." Her phone was vibrating nonstop. Someone from the Chronicle wanted a follow-up. Another outlet had already started speculating names. Then one of her interns burst in holding a tablet. "You should see this," he said. "Look who she is." On the screen was a screenshot from the live feed. Someone online had identified me by an old press photo. The daughter of Thomas and Rebecca Carter, the same family once accused of zoning fraud in 2017. Julia leaned back, silent. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she whispered Madeline Carter. She remembered the interview I'd given years ago about integrity and corporate ethics, the one that got buried when my father shut down the scandal. Julia rubbed her temples. She knew what publishing The Connection would do. It would explode. She hesitated for almost an hour, pacing, rewriting the headline again and again before finally typing the sentence that felt truest. "The woman once erased by her family is now rebuilding the world with kindness." When the story went live, it took 30 minutes to reach every major news outlet. Back at the monastery, I had no idea. The ceremony had ended in laughter and music. Ethan and I stood under the arches of the courtyard, cutting into a simple vanilla cake decorated with wildflowers. Grace stood beside us, icing on her cheek, proudly declaring herself Flower Girl of the Century. The guests were relaxed, some barefoot, holding glasses of champagne, while the kids danced in circles. Mia approached phone in hand. "You won't believe this," she said. "What's wrong?" I asked, laughing, as one of the kids tried to smear frosting on Ethan's sleeve. She turned the screen toward me. My photo, me holding Grace at the altar, was everywhere. CNN, the Chronicle blog's charity pages. A quote sat beneath it in bold: "Madeline Carter, daughter of the Denver real estate family, transforms silence into compassion." For a second, I didn't breathe. "They know," I said. Ethan looked at the screen, then at me. It was only a matter of time. I wanted to panic, but the courtyard around us was filled with laughter and sunlight. It felt wrong to let fear interrupt something so pure. "Let it be," I said quietly. "If this is how they find out, so be it." Daniel Hayes raised a toast from across the lawn, to Madeline and Ethan, proof that good stories still exist. Everyone cheered. The sound of clinking glasses mixed with the hum of music, and I realized something had shifted. This was no longer just our wedding. It had become something larger. A volunteer ran over with her phone. "We just hit 2 million viewers on the stream," she shouted. Sister Agnes smiled, hands clasped. "Miracles don't always come from heaven," she said softly. "Sometimes they're broadcast." I laughed, though tears threatened. The screen beside the sound booth showed donations climbing by the minute. 20,000, 5,100. Ethan wrapped an arm around me. "Look at that," he said. Hours later, after the guests had begun to leave and the children were tucked into their dormitories, I stood at the edge of the courtyard watching the mountains fade into dusk. My phone buzzed with messages from strangers. Thank yous, blessings, stories of people inspired to donate. My voice felt steady when I spoke aloud, mostly to myself. The silence I carried for years. The world finally hears it. By midnight, the donation counter crossed $2.3 million. News anchors called it the most meaningful wedding of the decade. Photos of Grace handing me the flowers filled timelines across countries. Somewhere in Denver, my parents' house glowed under its chandelier light, probably still unaware. But the world had already rewritten our family's story. And this time it wasn't about scandal. It was about Grace, both the little girl and the word itself. The Carter house glowed with warm light that night, music spilling from the tall windows into the quiet street. The reception for Chloe's wedding had gone perfectly. The speeches rehearsed, the guests perfectly dressed, the champagne perfectly chilled. It was the kind of event my mother lived for. Everything under control. Rebecca Carter stood near the bar, a glass of Merlot in her hand, laughing with one of Ryan's aunts. Thomas was on the patio, telling an investor how proud he was of his daughter. Chloe, still in her reception gown, was dancing barefoot with a few friends under a string of fairy lights. Then, one of the catering staff, a young man balancing a tray of desserts, paused by the television mounted on the wall. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said uncertainly. "You might want to see this." The room quieted as the TV volume rose. The evening news anchor's voice was calm, deliberate. And in national headlines tonight, an extraordinary event in Aspen. A wedding held at the St. Helena Monastery has taken the internet by storm. Millions have tuned in to watch what many are calling the most meaningful ceremony of the decade. Rebecca turned a polite smile still fixed on her face. "Turn that down, please. It's interrupting." The screen changed. There I was, in the courtyard holding Grace in my arms. The caption read, "Madeline Carter's Wedding for Change raises over $2 million for orphaned children." The tray slipped from the waiter's hands. Glass shattered across the floor. For a moment, no one breathed. Chloe's laughter died mid-sound. She froze, eyes locked on the screen. "Maddie," she whispered. Thomas's voice was low, hoarse. "Turn it up," the anchor continued. "The bride, once estranged from one of Denver's most prominent families, has drawn global attention for her act of generosity and compassion." Rebecca's fingers loosened around her wineglass. It fell, hitting the tile with a crack that echoed. Red liquid spread across the white marble. On the TV, the camera zoomed in on my face. Smiling, peaceful, surrounded by children. The video played sound from the vows. Ethan's voice steady, my laughter faint beneath the wind. Someone gasped. Thomas pressed a hand to his forehead, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "We erased her," he said quietly. "But the world carved her name in gold." Rebecca backed away from the TV, one hand clutching the table. "No," she whispered. "No, she did this to humiliate us." Chloe took a step toward her. "She did it for the kids, Mom." "Don't be naive," Rebecca snapped. "She knew what she was doing. Look at those cameras. She wanted attention." Thomas's voice was flat. "Attention or not, she's done more good tonight than we have in a lifetime." Chloe turned away, tears filling her eyes. The television showed the number of live donations still climbing 2.3 million and counting. My name flashed beside the headline again. Rebecca's breathing quickened. "I won't let her drag this family's name through." Thomas cut her off. "Our name, Rebecca. She's saving children while we throw parties for ourselves." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Chloe wiped her face with the back of her hand. "She invited the world to something beautiful, Mom. You wouldn't even invite her home." Rebecca stared at her daughter as if she'd been slapped. For a long time she didn't speak. Then she said almost to herself, "She's making us look small." Thomas sank into a chair. "She doesn't have to make us look small," he murmured. "We did that all by ourselves." Outside, the music from the patio had stopped. Guests were murmuring, checking their phones. Every screen in the room began to light up with notifications. The story was everywhere. Rebecca's phone started ringing, vibrating on the table. She ignored it. Then another call came, and another. She picked it up, finally saw the list of missed calls. Executives, reporters, old friends. A text flashed across the top of the screen. "We'd love to feature your daughter's story. Can we speak with you tonight?" Then another. "Congratulations, Rebecca. Your family raised the bar for philanthropy." Her hand trembled. The phone kept lighting up, buzzing with messages from people who had once avoided her after the 2017 scandal. 142 missed calls. She set the phone down slowly, her face pale under the chandelier light. In the quiet, the television replayed the image of me hugging Grace, sunlight streaming through the mountains behind us. From miles away, my mother watched as the world listened to the silence she had once taught me to keep. And for the first time in her life, there was nothing left for her to say. A week later, my name was everywhere, but so was theirs. Every major paper in the country ran the same headline in slightly different words. Carter Developments Scandal Reopened. After daughter's viral wedding, old footage resurfaced, boardroom clips, aerial shots of the company headquarters, my father shaking hands with city officials. This time, the smiling image wasn't a shield. It was evidence. The Financial Crimes Bureau announced that it was reviewing the 2017 zoning case in light of new witness statements. Thomas Carter was placed on administrative leave while investigators combed through records. Reporters camped outside the family estate, shoving microphones through the gates. Rebecca's PR firm released a single statement about her temporary suspension, then quietly removed her profile from their website. Even Chloe wasn't spared. The brand she endorsed for years dropped her overnight, citing a misalignment with core values. A headline on a gossip site read, "Influencer sister of viral bride loses contract," amid family ethics probe. Justice comes slowly, but when it arrives, it doesn't need to raise its voice. At St. Helena, the air stayed peaceful. The children were preparing for their summer classes, and the donations from the wedding had already funded the construction of a new dormitory. I spent most days in the study hall answering emails from strangers, teachers, parents, small donors from around the world. Messages poured in. "You reminded me that kindness still matters. I showed your video to my students. Thank you for turning hurt into hope." Each one felt like a small piece of light. One afternoon, as I typed a response to a woman from Oregon who wanted to host her own charity event, there was a knock at the door. I turned to see Julia Stein standing there, her posture careful as if entering a church. "Mind if I come in?" she asked. Of course, I said, motioning to the chair across from me. She sat folding her hands. I wanted to apologize. I didn't mean to expose you. Once the story connected your name, it was out of my hands. I should have protected your privacy. I smiled. "You didn't hurt me, Julia. Maybe this was how it needed to happen." Her eyes softened. "The world sees you differently now. Maybe they just see me clearly for the first time." She nodded, then glanced toward the courtyard. The sound of children's laughter carried through the open window. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I've written hundreds of stories, but none of them changed the way people talk about compassion like this one. It wasn't the story I said. It was the The world's tired of noise. It just needed something real." Julia stood to leave, hesitated at the door. "You know," she said, "the Chronicle is calling you the woman who redefined family values." I laughed under my breath. "That's ironic, isn't it?" Her smile was genuine. "Maybe not. Maybe you're reminding people that family doesn't always mean blood. It means the ones who choose to believe in you." When she left, I sat in silence, looking out at the mountains beyond the glass. The air shimmered in the afternoon heat. I thought about my parents, not with anger anymore, but with a quiet sense of distance, like remembering a house that used to feel like home. My inbox pinged again. Another message, this one from an anonymous sender. "You've done good work, Maddie. Don't let the noise pull you back down." For a moment, I wondered if it came from my father, but then I closed the laptop and decided not to wonder. The television in the common room buzzed softly in the background. A news anchor's voice drifted through the hallway. The donations from the Carter wedding continue to rise, surpassing $2.5 million. Experts say it marks a turning point in how the public engages with philanthropy, calling it the most meaningful wedding of the decade. Outside, the bells of St. Helena began to ring for evening prayer. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sound wash through the corridors. The world had found its noise again, but this time, it wasn't born from scandal or power. It was the sound of something pure, something no one could silence anymore. The late afternoon light at St. Helena had that golden weight to it, the kind that made even the old stone walls look soft. The mountains were wrapped in thin mist, and the air smelled faintly of rain and pine. The bells had just finished their evening call when I saw her walking up the path. Chloe looked smaller somehow. No stylist, no makeup team, no glittering dress. Just jeans, sneakers, and a beige coat too big for her shoulders. She stopped a few feet away, catching her breath. For a second, neither of us spoke. "I wasn't sure you'd come," I said finally. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to." Her voice cracked a little, but I had to. We sat on the bench outside the chapel, the wood cool beneath our hands. From where we sat, you could see the valley below, the last of the sunlight fading behind the ridge. "I've been watching the news," she said quietly. "You're everywhere. Every article, every talk show. They call you the woman who brought kindness back to the internet." She gave a small laugh, then added, "Mom hates that headline." I smiled. "That sounds about right." She folded her hands, staring at them. "She made me delete your name from my wedding list," she said finally. "I didn't want to. I just didn't want to fight her." "I know," I said. "I thought if I stayed quiet, it would keep the peace. But it didn't. I lost you anyway." She turned toward me, her eyes glistening. "You have no idea how many times I wanted to call. I was scared." I took a breath, feeling the wind shift around us. "You don't have to carry that guilt, Chloe. Mom was afraid. Afraid of what people might think, afraid of losing her image. You were just caught in it." She shook her head. "No, Maddie. I was old enough to know better, and I chose comfort over courage. That's on me." We sat in silence for a while, the sound of the bells echoing through the valley. A few petals from the nearby cherry trees floated past us, catching in her hair. She didn't brush them away. "I sent you the photo," she said softly. "The one with the little girl. You looked happy." I said, for the first time in years, I was exactly where I was meant to be. She smiled through her tears. "I think that's what scared me most, that you'd move on without us." "I didn't move on," I said. "I just stopped waiting for permission to live." Chloe leaned her head against my shoulder like she used to when we were kids, watching storms roll in through our bedroom window. "Mom won't admit it, but she watches your interviews. Every single one." I laughed quietly. "That sounds exhausting for her." "She's different lately," Chloe said. "Not softer, but quieter. Like she's starting to see what she missed." The sky had turned to a pale lavender, the mist deepening around the peaks. The air grew colder. I stood and walked toward the chapel door. "Come inside. I want to show you something." Inside, candles flickered along the stone walls, their reflections trembling in the glass windows. At the front of the small altar sat a wooden box carved with ivy patterns. I lifted the lid. It was filled with folded letters and notes from donors, messages from children around the world. "This is what they sent after the wedding," I said. "Some of them donated money. Others just wrote to say thank you. It's proof that people can still surprise you." Chloe touched the edge of the box, her expression unreadable. "You changed so much," she whispered. "Maybe I just stopped hiding." That night, after she left, I found an envelope slipped under my door. My name written in my mother's careful handwriting. I sat on the bed for a long time before opening it. "Maddie, you made me see what I've been worshipping all my life, control image pride, and what I lost because of it. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you'll believe that I am trying to learn who I am without those things. You were right. Truth wins in the end." "Mom." I read it twice, then folded it neatly. Forgiveness doesn't rewrite the past, but it takes away its power to keep hurting. I carried the letter into the chapel. The candles were still burning low. I opened the wooden box and placed it gently inside among the other messages. The flame light flickered against the glass, and for the first time, I felt the past finally quiet down. Outside, the bells began to ring again, their echoes soft like a heartbeat fading into peace. The sun rose quietly over St. Helena, dissolving the last traces of fog that clung to the mountains. The bells began their morning hymn slow and steady, each note rolling through the valley like a promise. I stepped out onto the balcony outside our room, the stones still cool beneath my bare feet. The sky was painted in soft gold, the kind of light that makes everything look forgiven. Below, the children were already awake, their laughter bouncing off the courtyard walls. Grace was leading a small parade, scattering wildflowers across the path as the others chased after her. The scent of dew and pine drifted up from the gardens. For a moment, I simply stood there, breathing it in. My phone buzzed on the table behind me, the vibration cutting through the silence. I glanced at the screen, missed calls stacked one after another. 142. I recognized some names, my mother, several reporters' numbers from television studios. I picked it up, thumb hovering over the glowing screen. Then I set it back down. Ethan stepped out beside me, wrapping a blanket over my shoulders. He looked at the phone, then at me. You're not going to answer. I shook my head. Not today. He smiled softly. Everything's changed, hasn't it? No, I said, watching the first beam of sunlight spill over the peaks. It's just finally in its right place. He leaned against the railing with me, both of us quiet. The world felt vast again, not heavy, just wide open, the kind of space where you can breathe without needing to explain yourself. The bells rang again, brighter this time, calling the day forward. I thought about the letter from my mother in the wooden box, about the girl I used to be, the one who mistook silence for weakness, who thought belonging had to be earned. They once told me I would ruin our family's image, but I never needed an image. I only needed the truth. And the truth, when it finally stands in the sunlight, is beautiful enough on its own. Down below, Grace spotted us on the balcony and waved both hands. "Breakfast," she shouted. The other kids laughed, throwing petals into the air. Ethan laughed too. "Your wedding guests are still celebrating," I smiled. "Let them. They're the only kind of guests I ever wanted." He took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. So what now? I looked toward the horizon where the light was spreading fast, touching every ridge and tree. Now we build something that lasts, not for headlines, not for them. For us. We stood there until the bells faded into the morning breeze, watching the children dance across the courtyard, the petals swirling like confetti. The world kept calling, but I didn't need to answer. Some stories don't require an ending. They just need space to rest, like sunlight on the mountains. If you've ever been underestimated, erased, or told you weren't enough, remember this. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the most powerful answer you can give. And when the world finally listens, let it be to the sound of your peace.